Before we get started with today's podcast episode, I just want to take a minute to share a little bit about Ballet BC's upcoming program Zenith, which is happening March 6th, 7th, and 8th in Vancouver at the Queen Elizabeth Theatre. Featuring a world premiere by local Canadian choreographer Andrea Penna, the return of the masterful work Passing from Johan Inger, and a new commission from Spanish choreographer Fernando Hernando Magadan, this program promises to be sensational. You can use code LET'SDANCE10 for 10% off your tickets, which are available now at balletbc.com. And don't worry, if you're not in Vancouver, the company is also touring this spring. They're going to be in Victoria, Toronto, London, Edinburgh, Germany, and a few other locations throughout the UK. So check out their website for all of those dates as well. And now, here's today's episode. Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. In today's podcast episode, we're going to get into part 3 of the competition countdown series, and today is all about rest and recovery during dance competition season, and specifically during dance competition events as well. So this is a topic that we have covered on the podcast previously, and if you're interested in diving into it even a little bit further, like in a little bit more depth, then certainly go and check out that podcast episode. It's called Rest and Recovery for Dancers. It's episode 9. I will also link it in the show notes so you can find it easily. So you may certainly go back and have a listen to that podcast episode. But today I want to talk specifically about rest and recovery when it comes to dance competitions, because it is a little bit different than how I approached it and how we've talked about it on that previous episode of the podcast. In that podcast episode, I focused on rest and recovery sort of with a lens or through a lens of periodization, and also through like the entire training season. So what does that look like? Where should rest days come in? Where should rest blocks come in, and things like that? And today I specifically want to dive into a little bit more practically, what does recovery especially look like when our dancers are at intense competitions or in a competition week, or when they're having to peak multiple days in a row and things like that. So, like I said, it is a topic that's been covered before, but today's lens is going to be very slightly different, specifically for competition. This information also applies to, say, a professional company that is like in a run of shows. So although I am specifically talking about competition in this little mini 4-part series on the podcast, you can certainly listen around the edges and apply this to other scenarios that operate similarly to a dance competition. If you're in, a run of shows or something like that, the same information applies. So interpret that how you need to for how it applies to yourself, but I'm going to talk through the lens of competition today. So before we dive into the different types of recovery and how we prioritize them and all of that we're going to talk about today, I just want to give you a little bit of a definition. I like words, I like definitions of what recovery actually is. So recovery is defined as the ability to regain function. And that means that it is dependent on our previous level of function within the body and also potentially the healing process. So sometimes we confound healing and recovery or use the terms interchangeably. We'll talk about recovery from like an injury or things like that. But if there's something pathological going on in the tissues in the body, so there has been an actual injury, really that is what we term like the healing process. Or process, depending on what country you're in.
when we're talking about recovery is a process that happens after every single session that we participate in. So where we are physically exerting ourselves. So that could be after a class, that could be after rehearsal, it can be after a show, it can be after a competition. Recovery is continually happening within our body, whereas healing is something that's going to happen if there has been an injury involved. So I just want to clear up a little bit of like the semantics behind that, because sometimes I think they get confused or they get kind of used interchangeably, and they are a little bit different. And so recovery is dependent on our previous level of function and also the healing process if there is injury involved. So we're going to, for the sake of today's podcast episode, just talk about recovery from the standpoint of recovering from a physical activity or from physical exertion, assuming that there is no injury present. So the healing process is not necessarily involved. It's just recovering from that exertion that the body has been put through. And like I said in the definition, it is dependent on our previous level of function. And this is the reason why recovery is so important, because if we're constantly depleting our system or depleting our body, then we're never going to be able to sort of get back to 100%. So let's say we start at 100% and we exert ourselves down to, I don't know, let's say 75%. We have the ability to recover back up to 100%. But if we only recover to, let's say, 85% from that 75%, so we only recover 10%, and then we go and exert ourselves again, and maybe we deplete down to 65, we're going to have a much, much harder time getting back to 100% if we already only started at 85%. So you can see it becomes a bit of like a downward spiral or a downward trajectory. So that is one of the reasons why we really want to make sure that we are ideally prioritizing recovery after every session or after every training session, essentially, or in this case, competition. So after each day of a competition, so that we're getting ourselves back as close to 100% as possible. It may not be possible to get back to 100% each and every single time, but as long as we're getting back as close as possible, we're not going to continue that sort of downward spiral, because once we start to deplete ourselves more and more and more, that's when we are going to be more susceptible to pain and injury and all of those types of things. So that, just to give you a little bit of like context or a bit of a definition of what recovery is and what we're looking at when we're talking about recovery within the body. There are different types of recovery, and I generally break them up into sort of three main categories. So we have our passive recovery, we have our active recovery, and then we have what I call like adjunctive or adjuncts to recovery. And we're going to go through each of those categories and sort of talk a little bit about what we want to prioritize within those. So passive recovery is exactly like it sounds. It is completely passive, and there's no activity associated with that. So this would be what we would call like complete rest, or we'll often call this rest when we're thinking of passive recovery. And the things that are happening during passive recovery, or the reasons why it is important, is we get metabolic recovery going on within the metabolic systems in the body. It is the time when our muscles can repair if there has been any like damage or injury. We also have healing that happens during this time. It gives us a mental break from the activity. So in this case, from dance, it gives us a chance to sort of step away. And passive recovery can look like a lot of different things. It could be reading a book. It could be listening to music. It could be watching a movie. It could be hanging out with your friends. It can be all sorts of different things that are not activity-based, so physical activity-based in this case. And the most important part of passive recovery is sleep. And especially in the case of dance competitions, the lens that we're looking at recovery through today, that is really the part that we want to try and prioritize. Things like reading a book, listening to music, all of those types of things, they certainly can play a role, but they maybe are not what we're going to be prioritizing when we're really busy with preparing for the next day at competition or things like that. So that's not to say we want to completely forget about those, but those might not be where you're spending the most amount of your time and energy on those other types of passive recovery. But we certainly want to try to prioritize sleep as much as we can. And this one's really tricky because of scheduling with competitions nowadays, it is not uncommon for them to run really late into the night. And I have huge issues with this. Like, I really think it's unnecessary for a competition to be running till 11 p.m. at night, and especially when there's younger kids involved. But even our older teenagers and adolescents need sleep. And so to expect them to be at the venue and at award ceremonies and stuff till really, really late at night, and then be back the next morning for sessions that start sometimes as early as 7 a.m. now, I've been hearing, which is absurd to me. Really, again, in my mind, there's like nothing that should be happening before 9 a.m. And especially considering we know that dancers arrive at the theater or at the venue hours before their actual call time. So if they are meant to be on the stage at 9 a.m., they're likely arriving at the theater as early as possible. I mean, a lot of times the theaters aren't going to open till 1 hour before, so maybe they're arriving at 8 a.m. But in an ideal world, they would probably want to be there even slightly before that. So all of that to say that prioritizing sleep is really, really tricky and really challenging. But as much as we can, we do want to try and prioritize getting an adequate amount of sleep each night of a competition. And for most dancers, that is going to be somewhere between 8 and 10 hours of sleep per night. And when I say these numbers, when I do workshops with dancers and stuff, they all kind of stare at me like in amazement. They're like, what? Because the idea of them getting 8 hours of sleep, let alone 10 hours of sleep, is just like a little bit unheard of for them. So if they're getting 6 hours of sleep, they think they're getting a lot. But in reality, especially because most dancers participating in competitions are, children and adolescents, they need between 8 and 10 hours of sleep per night. And so again, some of these issues are systemic in terms of how competitions are being organized and run. So we don't always have control over this, but wherever possible, we'd want to try and prioritize sleep. And that might mean that if a competition runs a little bit later into the evening, and then normally you would go out for some sort of a team dinner or team bonding thing after, maybe we need to reconsider that, okay, let's prioritize everybody getting back to their own room or going home and getting some sleep, and then do the team celebratory dinner or bonding or whatever after the last night of the competition, or after the competition's over, even a week later, say, okay, now let's come together and let's celebrate that. So little things like that can make a big difference. And I think we need to also think about supporting competitions that are running off more reasonable hours. I know there are competitions who have policies that they won't start events before a certain time in the morning, before like 9 or 9:30 in the morning, and they won't run past 9 p.m. at night. And even that is a long day for a dancer, but also for the teachers and the adjudicators and everybody else who's involved. So just things to think about in terms of when we're thinking about passive recovery, we really want to be thinking mostly about sleep when it comes to competition passive recovery. Throughout the rest of the dance year, we're certainly going to prioritize other types of passive recovery more perhaps, but during competition, really trying to prioritize sleep as our main form of passive recovery. Then we have our active recovery. And active recovery simply means participating in low intensity movement that we do after the kind of strenuous or higher intensity movement that we've been participating in. So dance is obviously going to be our more strenuous activity. And then active recovery would be something low intensity that we would do to facilitate the recovery process. And active recovery is really important because it helps to increase blood flow throughout our body, which can help to decrease any lactic acid buildup that might be happening. It helps to remove metabolic waste from our system. So lactic acid would be one of those waste products, but there's also other metabolic waste products. It can decrease how much post-exercise pain or fatigue we experience in our body. There's all sorts of benefits to active recovery. And in the case of dancers, if dance is our high or our strenuous activity or high impact activity, things that might be good alternatives for active recovery that are low impact might be going for a walk, or potentially some like easy stationary cycling, like no crazy resistance or anything, but just kind of like spinning to flush the legs out. Swimming can be good active recovery, and depending on the competition, a lot of times if we're traveling for competitions and staying in hotels and stuff, they often do have swimming pools or maybe even like hot tubs and things like that. So that can be an option for active recovery as well. We just have to make sure that the intensity stays low enough. Like, you're not going to go and swim a ton of laps trying to get a cardio workout or that type of thing. It's like keeping the intensity low and more just going and hanging out in the pool, maybe doing some water walking, maybe swimming a few easy laps. Like, you just want to keep the intensity low. It could incorporate things like light stretching and things like that. Although for dancers, I don't know that dancers are very good at what I would call light stretching. So it's not necessarily something that I do advocate a lot for in dancers, using stretching as active recovery, because I think we already stretch enough and it is part of often our actual dance practice. So other types of active recovery might be the things we want to focus on more. And it can just be as simple as taking a 10 or 15 minute walk around the area. Just get out, get some fresh air, clear your head, and just allow your muscles to kind of get a little bit of increased blood circulation, help with that sort of, removal of metabolic waste and all of that type of thing. So that would be our kind of active recovery and things that we might consider or prioritize if we are using active recovery as part of our recovery toolbox. The last category of recovery is what I call adjuncts. And these are maybe considered sometimes a little bit more like the gimmicky parts of recovery. And this is, you'll see like so much stuff marketed for recovery when it comes to sport and performance and things like that. But there is some advantages. There are some advantages to these forms of recovery. So essentially, adjunctive recovery is any therapeutic technique that enhances recovery. And so this could be things like massage. It can be myofascial release in the form of like foam rolling or using like balls, a tennis ball or a lacrosse ball to roll things out. It can be certain types of mobility work. It can be breath work. And then it also commonly encompasses what we call cryotherapy or compression. And I'm going to come back to those in a second. The purpose or the benefit of these types of recovery are that it can help to decrease muscle pain or soreness or tension, like increased stiffness in muscles that we experience after strenuous activity. It helps with blood flow and circulation. Again, so similar to active recovery, some of these modalities can help with that blood flow and circulation. They can help to decrease stress or increase relaxation, which especially things like doing kind of some of the mobility work or some of the breathing work really tap into those systems. Helps stimulate the autonomic nervous system, so helps with nervous system regulation. So there's all sorts of benefits to using some of these adjunct types of recovery. If you have listened to the other podcast on rest and recovery, I talk a bit about how these types of recovery tools don't make up for like a lack of proper sleep and proper passive and active recovery. So generally what we are thinking about or what we are trying to prioritize is using passive recovery and active recovery to a greater extent, and maybe some of these adjuncts to a slightly lesser extent. And what I mean by that is no amount of, let's say, foam rolling or, massage or things like that are ever going to make up for a lack of adequate sleep in terms of how our body is able to rest and repair and recover. And so we can't use these in lieu of the other types of recovery, but we can use them to help enhance overall recovery. I specifically want to talk about cryotherapy and compression because these ones get asked a lot. And when it comes to dance competitions, these actually might have a bigger benefit than they may during other times in the dance season. So cryotherapy is essentially cold therapy. So cryo means cold or means ice, or we think about it. And so things that are common or that you are maybe a little bit familiar with would be things like ice baths, or using there's like fancy machines that you can get. There's a whole bunch of different brand names, but they are sort of like sleeves that you'd wrap around a certain part of your body, and then they help to like kind of cool or ice like that area of the body. So cryotherapy essentially just means cold therapy, and there is definitely some evidence to show that it can help with short-term recovery. So when we are trying to enhance recovery between like bouts of strenuous activity that are close together. So in this case, this would be like 2 back-to-back competition days, for instance. Things like ice baths can actually be quite beneficial in terms of that short-term recovery. When we look at longer term in terms of building strength and how we want our body to adapt to the like physical demands that we're imposing on it, this might actually interrupt some of that adaptation process that we want in the long term. But short term, when we're looking at back-to-back bouts of strenuous activity, it can actually be really helpful. So something like an ice bath can actually be really beneficial for a dancer, especially if there's back-to-back days of competition. With ice baths, they do not have to be really long. I think a lot of dancers get freaked out about like, oh my God, how long do I have to stay in, or like those types of things. And realistically, 10 minutes would be the goal, depending on the degree of the ice bath. And if you are participating, like cold plunges and things like that have become really, really popular. And in some of those cases, the water temperatures are really, really low. Like you might be in a tub that's like 4 degrees Celsius or even lower than that, like maybe even like 2 degrees Celsius, in which case you're not going to be able to stay in for 10 minutes. Like they're just not going to be able to. But if we are thinking about practically as dancers, what type of an ice bath it is we're going to be able to utilize, realistically, you're either going to be at home or you're going to be in a hotel probably, which means you're just dealing with a regular bathroom bathtub. So you're going to fill it with cold water and then ideally be able to like maybe put some ice cubes into it. So whether you're staying in a hotel and you get some like ice from the ice machine, or if you're at home and you have some ice in your freezer or whatever, you're going to throw some ice into a cold water bath. That bath is not going to be approaching 0 degrees at all. You're going to be, I'm not even going to like really try and guess, but it's going to be upwards of 10 degrees Celsius for sure, and probably even upwards of, you know, potentially even 15 degrees Celsius. And so in ice baths or cold immersion that is higher temperatures like that, you will be able to stay in for longer, and we ideally want to stay in for about 10 minutes. So I don't expect people to go and like, you know, have a thermometer and be able to exactly measure like exactly how cold the water is. But just know that if you are in sort of a regular residential bathtub and you filled it with cold water yourself, you're not going to be approaching those like sub-zero temperatures. Now, there are people who may be going to commercial cold plunges, or even you see videos sometimes of people like chipping ice off a frozen lake and like jumping in or things like that. So like certainly there are instances where maybe it is going to be quite cold, in which case you may not be able to spend 10 minutes in it. But regardless, the idea is that that cold immersion or that cryotherapy can help to decrease the pain and soreness and tightness that we experience in muscles after strenuous activity, and also help with blood flow and circulation and all of those types of things. So cryotherapy or cold immersion may be beneficial in the short term when we're thinking about it just between like consecutive days of competition. And for dancers in particular, it is usually the lower extremities we're interested in. So it's not necessarily it is not usually necessary to do like a cold bath where you're submerged all the way up to your shoulders. Maybe it's just going to be from the waist down, or depending on what you're dealing with, if you have an area that's bothering you, like maybe like feet and ankles are sore, or maybe you have a knee that's sore, you may only need to submerge like that part of your body into a cold tub or a cold plunge. The other thing I want to talk about specifically is compression. And so again, there are these like fancy compression devices that use kind of systemic pneumatic compression. So a lot of them are the boots that you'll sort of see. So you put your legs inside these, they look like giant boots, and they'll come up to like kind of the top of your thigh. And then they've got these pumps inside. And so there's this like compression that cycles through and kind of goes in waves, and you can set like the different rates and things like that. And these types of compression garments can be really, really beneficial, again, when you have consecutive bouts of strenuous activity, so multiple shows in a row or competition days back to back. However, they are exceedingly expensive, and most people do not have access to this type of compression garment. Although I do know that there are some competitions who have kind of exhibitor spaces at the competition, or maybe conventions more so. And sometimes they'll bring in companies to like demo these products. So you might be able to try them out for a few minutes, but that's certainly not the norm yet in the dance world. I do know some professional dance companies actually have invested in these and have them available to their dancers as well. So some dancers will have access to these, but the majority of dancers will likely not. But we can also use static compression garments. And so those would be things like compression socks, or like a compression sleeve for the calf or for like the knee potentially. Usually we're using compression on the lower extremities, especially for dancers, because dance is so lower extremity heavy. And these types of compression garments can just help with preventing blood sort of pooling in the lower extremities from gravity, kind of pulling it down there, and help with lymphatic circulation and lymphatic return and things like that. So this is something that dancers could consider, is in between their dances at a competition or at the end of the day when they're finished dancing for the day, using some sort of compression socks or compression garments to help aid recovery before they have to dance again the next day. And these can be especially helpful if you are traveling, and especially traveling on airplanes and things like that, because a lot of people will get a little bit of kind of pooling or maybe even swelling in the lower extremities from prolonged sitting and traveling and things like that. And so compression garments can really help with that, like preventing that from happening, so that when you get to where you are going for dance, that you are feeling a little bit more refreshed and ready to actually perform. So those types of compression can certainly be beneficial when it comes to recovery. Again, when we have these like strenuous activities that are really, really close together and we want to recover as much as possible in a really short amount of time. And then, like I said, things like massage, you can, potentially book yourself in with a massage therapist, or have a friend or a parent or somebody do a little bit of massage, or even using those massage tools like massage guns. If you have one of those are great things to take with you to a competition. So you can do a little bit of that as a recovery technique, or doing some myofascial release or rolling. So bringing a foam roller or a ball and rolling out your muscles as a recovery tactic as well can be really helpful as a way of trying to promote recovery as much as possible before you have to dance again the next day. So those are kind of just some examples of some of the adjunct things that we think about when we're thinking about recovery between strenuous bouts of activity. So the biggest difference, or the thing I want to highlight the most, is during the regular season of dance, and when we're thinking about dance just from a more holistic view in terms of your regular training schedules and not necessarily like a competition weekend, we really want to try and prioritize more of the passive recovery and having rest days built into our schedule, and using active recovery a little bit as well, and not necessarily becoming overly reliant on some of the adjunct types of recovery. But when we are in a competition season or a competition weekend or week or however long that event is, we probably want to rely a little bit more on some of the adjunct types of recovery. So whether that be massage or myofascial release or compression or cryotherapy, because we are going to be less able to prioritize passive recovery and even some of the other active recovery techniques. So that's not to say that those aren't super important throughout the rest of the training year. But when we are thinking about competition as a more defined timeline and, like a spike in our training load and a peak time in our season, then what we are doing for recovery to maximize recovery for the next day switches a little bit, and we can become a little bit more reliant on some of those adjunct types of recovery. So I am going to wrap things up there. Hopefully that has been helpful to you to understand what recovery is and why it is important, but also ways that you can sort of implement it or try and prioritize it in a competition weekend or a competition week where things are going to look a little bit different than they do throughout the rest of the dance season. So just shifting what we are doing and how we are prioritizing recovery during those times can definitely be helpful to make it through the competition season and really try and maintain that level of functioning as high as possible so that we're not continually depleting down, that we can prioritize recovery and come as close to 100% each day that we are competing. And I realize that we're not necessarily going to be coming back up to 100% after every single day, but the goal is just to try and maximize recovery as much as possible so that we're not dropping further and further and further down as the competitions continue on. So I hope that was helpful for everyone. If you have questions or want any clarification on anything, please feel free to reach out to me. And as an extra favor today, I would really appreciate it if you would share this podcast episode with one dance buddy who you think could really benefit from this information in terms of rest and recovery specifically for competition. So send it to somebody on your competition team or send it to one of your teachers or parents within your competition team, whoever you think might benefit from this information today. And I hope you all have an amazing competition season. Thank you so much for listening and have a great rest of your day.